Wait, start over.
Oh, are you ready?
Yep.
Are you good?
I'm good.
3,
2, 1. Go.
Next up, we're going to do the lap weld. We talked about the beads and how to get comfortable with your welding, so now we're going to take 2 pieces of metal and weld them together. I've got 2 small flat pieces here. Sometimes it could be anything that you're welding out in the field or whatever. These are already nice, clean, brand new pieces of steel. If I were welding an old manure spreader or something where the metal is already rusted and decayed a little bit, you're going to want to make sure you grind it, clean it up, get it prepared to weld. Welding is, I would say, at least 80% preparation, and then the last 20% is the actual welding and being comfortable with it. Without a nice prepared piece of steel, no matter how good of a technique you have, you're never going to get a good weld if it's rusty and rotted and decayed. So you want to clean it up, make sure you got a nice surface to weld on. The table I have right now is thin enough to where I can lay them over top and grasp like that. If you don't have that opportunity available to you, for the lap weld, we're just gonna lap the 2 pieces like this, one over top of the other. A butt weld would be like this. We'll do that later. So for right now, we're gonna lap the 2 pieces like that. If you had to, you could just clamp them like that with your ground and then get them in the position you wanted to, and then lay it however you can. I'm kind of restricted with space here, but you want to lay it to where it's comfortable for you. It doesn't matter what position it's in. If you like welding over your head, you could do that as long as your rod has that capability. But just get it wherever you feel comfortable doing it, and get it solid so that it's not moving around as you're trying to weld. So if you lay it on the table, make sure that you clamp it somehow, or even hold it with your hand. You could do that too. Like I said, these gloves and the suit that you're wearing is protective, so you're not going to get burned. If you put your finger right on the weld, yes, eventually it will heat through and burn you, so just be mindful of that. But you are absolutely able to hold here and weld up here without having an issue. So make sure you're solid, make sure your ground is connected to your metal, and if not, at least connected to a piece of metal where it'll be conductive no matter where you're welding, just to make sure you complete the circuit. So we're going to go ahead. This is the easiest for me. I've got it clamped right to the table, to the 2 pieces of metal. Now before we start, there's a couple things you need to be aware of. When you lay a bead of weld on a metal, it heats it up, and then as it cools, it shrinks and it pulls. So without the proper precautions or steps taken, you could distort your metal in a way that you don't want it to be distorted. So the first thing we're going to do when we lay our lap like this, we're going to tack it so that when we're welding it, it doesn't move. So we're going to tack 4 corners. We're going to tack here, we're going to tack here, and then we're going to flip the steel over and tack the other side. What'll happen is if I just laid this here and I just laid my bead down through there and I flip it over, what'll happen is your 2 pieces of metal that are lapped together here and my bead is there, what'll happen is it'll pull like that, because this side will shrink as it cools and it'll pull the steel apart like that. That's why we're going to want to tack all 4 corners, and that'll help hold the steel together so that as it cools, it doesn't pull the metal and distort it. So that's what we'll do first, is we'll tack all 4 corners. Hover, strike. And it hasn't got to be much, just get a little puddle started so that you can see the connection between the 2 pieces of steel. I mean, you don't want it too little to where it'll just snap easily, but you don't need to lay a bead. It just needs to be a nice little tack. Then we'll do the other corner, cover, strike. And then, so with that little bit of weld, it's not going to distort our steel as much because it's just a little bit, and as it cools, it doesn't have the strength to pull as if it were a full bead laying across there. So if you look, our steel is still flat with itself, and it's still tight. So now we're going to tack this side, and then actually what we'll do is we'll tack this bottom corner, and then we'll come up and we'll just start laying our bead. Because once we get this corner tacked and these 2 are already tacked, then everything's solid. Once we start welding, it shouldn't pull too bad. So I'll tack this bottom corner and then I'll weld to it. Cover, strike. So now that I'm welding to it, I'm going to want to take and chip away any of the flux that's on there, because what happens if we weld our flux that's already on there, it'll kind of distort our bead a little bit. And that same goes for your torching. If you have a torched piece of steel and you've got a lot of slag on the backside from where you torched, you're going to want to either grind that off or chip it off. Make sure it's nice and clean, because any little thing that's on that steel, whether it's rust, slag, flux, anything that's not steel, is going to distort your bead and either make it porous, or it's going to explode and it'll take your puddle and just blow a hole in your puddle. So it won't be a nice, clean, solid weld. Oops. Alright, ready? Cover. Strike. So what I'm doing now is I'm making sure that I come up on the flat piece of steel as I'm running my bead to make sure that I get both pieces of steel melted evenly so that it's a nice strong weld. If you don't melt one and you continue to melt the other one, it's not going to be as strong, because the one that's not melting isn't going to have any grasp to the other steel. If that made any sense. So if you look, you can see where the edge of this steel was, and I'm coming up right up over top of the edge of the steel and still coming down. So what you want to do is you want to make sure you get down into this piece as well as this piece to make sure that you're melting both pieces evenly. That way when it swirls, they both got skin in the game, and so that they're both equally melted and holding on to each other. So that's what it should look like when you're done. It might look a little nicer than that, but you should have a nice, solid, uniform bead all the way down through that's even on both sides. If you've got a big, here, I'll use this instead, it's easier. If you've got a big puddle down here and it kind of looks like it just melted away the side of this one, that means that you're concentrating too much on this piece of steel. If you've got it melted right here and it's just a big glob of steel all the way down the side of this piece, that means you're concentrating too much on this. You need to make sure that it's cut into both pieces in order to make a nice uniform weld. So we'll flip it over. And again, make sure you chip away the flux from your tacks before you start welding. Make sure you got a nice clean spot. So now I'll change my rod because that's low enough. I'm not going to get any weld on that, what's left there. So I'll put a new rod in, and now I'll just go ahead and just weld my bead right down through. Again, making sure that my angle is correct. If you look at this angle right here, that's kind of where you want to be. You want to be right 45, well, you're going to split that 90-degree angle, which is the lap weld. You've got this face of the steel and this face of that steel, so that makes a 90-degree angle, and you want to make it cut it right in half, 45-degree angle between both pieces of steel, and you want to make sure, like I said, that you're coming across to both pieces. Sorry. If one was thinner than the other, say you had a thick piece and a thin piece, which I'm sure you'll practice that later, then you're going to want to concentrate on the thicker piece more than the thinner piece, because you're going to get more heat into the thicker piece to melt it, and the heat created there will also melt the thinner piece as well. So you'll want to focus more on the thick one, because if you focus too much on the thin one, it'll melt that one instead of making a nice pool to weld both of them together. So we'll go ahead and do this bead here. Cover, strike. And again, as I'm coming down through, I don't stop once I get to my tack. I just come right over top of it, just smooth right over top of it. You can make as many passes on a weld as you want. It's only going to make it stronger. Just because there's already weld there, I could go through and I could make a weld on either side of that bead, and that'll improve the strength of it. So now that I've got that, I can just chip it off. And now I've got a nice lap weld. So now both pieces, you can see the metal is still tight in the center because we tacked all 4 corners, so it didn't spread like it could have, and it's full length welds all the way down through, and I didn't stop at the tacks. Good?